Chapter 3. Lincoln in Illinois as a rail splitter, a clerk, and a volunteer. Public attention in the western and southern country now began to be attracted, more decidedly than before, to the vast resources and fertile bottom lands of Illinois. This state, organized as a territory in 1809 and admitted into the Union 9 years later in 1818, had, even as late as 1820, only a population of 55,211. And this was almost exclusively located south of the National Road, which crosses the Kaskaskia River at Vandalia, extending nearly due west to Alton. Notwithstanding the severe labors of opening the forests on the rich western soil, and the long period that must necessarily elapse before the perfect subjugation of the land into cultivated farms, there seems to have been a general avoidance, even to comparatively a late period, of the open prairie, which is now thought to offer such preeminent facilities for cultivation, with almost immediate repayment for the toil bestowed. The settlers who had gone into Illinois evidently placed a low estimate upon the prairie lands, and always settled on the banks of some stream on which there was plenty of timber, seeking the forest by preference for their homes. The open character of the country undoubtedly repelled emigration and caused it to be concentrated on the chief streams for a long time, until at last it commenced in earnest. The earliest waves of this emigration, as in the case of Indiana, came from Virginia and Kentucky, so that the character of its society and legislation was strongly colored by the southern element. While there was still discernible a lurking attachment to the peculiar institutions of the states on the other side of the Ohio River, the general tenor of public sentiment and action was as positive and distinct as were the opinions of the northern settlers of these new commonwealths. Yet the views of slavery at that time prevalent in southern Indiana and Illinois were not much diverse from those which were entertained in the communities from which these settlers had come. Slavery was regarded as an evil to be rid of, and to make sure of this, those who were not already too much entangled with it left in large numbers for a region which, by request of Virginia herself, the donor, was forever protected from the inroads of this moral and social mischief. From 1820 to 1830, however, there was a marked extension of settlements northward toward the center of the state, and along the Mississippi to Galena, where the mines were beginning to be worked. The rivers along which the principal settlements had been made, aside from the great boundary rivers, the Mississippi, the Ohio, and the Wabash, were the Kaskaskia, the Embarrass, and the Sangamon, together with their branches. A few settlements also had been in the Rock River country and in the range of Peoria, and the population thus distributed had now, 1830, reached 157,445. The brothers of Thomas Lincoln had previously removed to a more northern direction in Indiana than that which he had occupied, both settling in the Blue River country, Mordecai in Hancock County, where he soon after died, and Josiah in Harrison County. Whether their example had its influence upon Thomas, or whether the nomadic spirit which was a part of his character reasserted its sway over him, we do not know. But whatever may have been the cause, immediate or remote, he left Indiana in the spring of 1830 to seek another place of abode in the state of Illinois. In addition to his own family, he was accompanied by those of the 2 daughters and sons-in-law of his second wife. The journey, which occupied 15 days, was accomplished by ox teams. Abraham at this time was 21 years of age. Mr. Lincoln had seen the growth of Kentucky from almost the very start to a population of nearly 700,000, and he had lived in Indiana from the time its inhabitants numbered only 65,000 until they had reached nearly 350,000. As he first set foot within the limits of Illinois, its vast territory had comparatively but just begun to be occupied, scarcely at all, as we have seen, except in the extreme southern portion, and here almost exclusively along the principal streams. In a country so poorly supplied with wood and water as Illinois, such sites would naturally be the first to be taken up, and, with a prairie addition, suited the tastes even of those to whom the level open country was forbidding in appearance. Mr. Lincoln pushed forward to the central part of the state where such locations were still abundant. A more beautiful country than that of the Sangamon Valley could not easily have been anywhere discovered by an explorer. It was not strange that the report of such lands, if he heard it in his southern Indiana home, should have attracted even so far one who was bred to pioneer life and inherited a migratory disposition. He first settled on the Sangamon Bottom in Macon County. Passing over the Illinois Central Railroad as you approached Decatur, the county seat of Macon, from the south, a slightly broken country is reached 2 or 3 miles from that place, and presently the north fork of the Sangamon, over which you pass, a mile from the town. This stream flows westwardly, uniting with the south fork near Jamestown, 10 miles from Springfield. Following down this north fork for a distance of about 10 miles from Decatur, you come to the immediate vicinity of the first residence of Abraham Lincoln, with his father's family in Illinois. During the first season of their abode in the new state, Abraham continued to help his father in the farm work. And one of the first duties which presented itself was the necessity of fencing a field on the rich bottomlands which had been selected for cultivation. For this purpose, with the help of one laborer, Abraham Lincoln at this time split 3,000 rails, a task indicative of his energy and perseverance no less than of his great physical strength and endurance. The hand who assisted him in the exploit, named John Hanks, a distant relative of his mother, is yet living, and bears unqualified testimony to the earnest strength with which the maul and the wedge were wielded by the future president. These rails afterward became the theme of joke, song, and story. During the presidential campaign of 1860, Mr. Lincoln was accidentally present at the sitting of the Republican State Convention at Decatur, near his old Sangamon home, and was received with the greatest enthusiasm. He had scarcely taken his seat when Mr. Oglesby of Decatur announced to the delegates that an old Democrat of Macon County, who had grown gray in the service of that party, desired to make a contribution to the convention, and the offer being accepted, forthwith 2 old-time fence rails, decorated with flags and streamers, were borne through the crowd into the convention bearing the inscription, Abraham Lincoln, the rail candidate for president in 1860. 2 rails from a lot of 3,000 made in 1830 by John Hanks and Abe Lincoln, whose father was the first pioneer of Macon County. The effect was electrical. One spontaneous burst of applause went up from all parts of the wigwam, which grew more and more deafening as it was prolonged, and which did not wholly subside for 10 or 15 minutes after. The cheers upon cheers which rent the air could have been heard all over the adjacent country. Of course, old Abe was called out and made an explanation of the matter. He stated that some 30 years ago, then just emigrating to the state, he stopped with his mother's family for 1 season in what is now Macon County, that he built a cabin, split rails, and cultivated a small farm down on the Sangamon River some 6 or 8 miles from Decatur. These rails, he was informed, were taken from that fence, but whether they were or not, he had mauled many and much better ones since he had grown to manhood. His remarks were received with applause, and the rails were thenceforth in demand in every state of the Union in which industry is honored, where they were borne in processions of the people and hailed by hundreds of thousands as a symbol of triumph and as a glorious vindication of freedom and of the rights and dignity of free labor. To return, however, to the settlers on the Sangamon. Having built their cabin and fenced their farm, they broke the ground and raised a crop of sod corn on it the first year, the sons-in-law meantime having settled at other places in the country. A hard siege of fever and ague afflicted the new settlers before the close of the first autumn, which so greatly discouraged them that they determined to seek a more congenial location. They remained, however, through the succeeding winter, which was the season of the deep snow of Illinois. For 3 weeks or more, the snow was 3 feet deep upon a level, and the weather intensely cold. There was great consequent suffering entailed upon beasts as well as men, all being totally unprepared for such extraordinary severity of climate. Our pioneers were fortunate in having a sufficient supply of corn, but they had laid up an insufficient quantity of meat, and the deep snow seriously interfered with their dependence upon their rifles. Abraham, however, willingly braved any and every hardship to relieve their household wants, and by his untiring exertions managed to furnish enough game to keep the family in food, though he was not a first-rate hunter, his love for books having early overcome the fondness and enthusiasm with which he had at first adopted the rifle. We seldom went hunting together, writes one of his early associates on this subject. Abe was not a noted hunter, as the time spent by other boys in such amusements was improved by him in the perusal of some good book. Discouraged by the sickness and the severe winter which had befallen them during the first year, the family remained here no longer than the spring of 1831, moving into Coles County, some 60 or 70 miles to the eastward on the upper waters of the Kaskaskia and Embera. There the father rested at length from his wanderings, and there he died at a ripe old age on the 17th of January, 1851, in his 73rd year. Abraham, however, did not accompany his father and family in this, their last removal, but, being now of age, assumed for the first time his independence and commenced life on his own account. During the preceding winter, young Lincoln, together with his stepmother's son, John D. Johnston, and his former fellow laborer, John Hanks, yet residing in Macon County, had engaged themselves to one Dennis Opholt to aid him in a flatboat trip from Beardstown, Illinois, to New Orleans, agreeing to meet with him at Springfield as soon as the snow should disappear. But when the snow melted in the early part of March 1831, the country was so flooded as to make traveling by land impracticable, so they purchased a large canoe in which they came down the Sangamon River. On reaching the place of rendezvous, they found that Opholt had been disappointed by a person on whom he had relied to furnish him a boat on the Illinois River. Accordingly, the three adventurers hired themselves to their employer at the rate of $12 per month each, and then all hands set to work getting out timber and building a boat at Old Sangamon Town on the Sangamon River, 7 miles northwest of Springfield. In this boat, they made a successful voyage to New Orleans and back, substantially on the terms of the original contract. It has been said by his friends that Mr. Lincoln frequently referred with much pleasant humor to his early experience, relating some of its incidents in such a manner as to afford abundant amusement to his auditors. In truth, he was a youth who could adapt himself to this or any other honest work, which his circumstances required of him, with a cheerfulness and alacrity, a certain practical humor, rarely equaled. To him, the hardest labor was mere pastime, and his manly presence to other laborers was a constant inspiration and a charm which lightened their burdens. It was midsummer when the young flat boatman returned from this trip, his second and last in that capacity. Opholt, the manager of the expedition, undertook to establish himself in business at New Salem, 20 miles below Springfield in Menard County, where he opened a store and also a flouring mill. Having taken a liking to young Lincoln during their flatboat enterprise, he was naturally anxious to secure his services in the new business in which he was about to embark. Having no other immediate employment in view and being entirely dependent upon his own exertions for a living, Abraham accepted the offer and entered upon the duties of a clerk, attending to both branches of his employer's business, which it is almost needless to say were faithfully and cheerfully performed. While acting in this capacity, he made many acquaintances and friends, and won the respect and confidence of all with whom he had business dealings, and it was during this period of his life that he came to be familiarly known as Honest Abe. An honest man's the noblest work of God, is the oft-quoted remark of the poet, and truly this appellation, which has so closely adhered to Abraham Lincoln from that day to the latest hour of his life, is a richer tribute of praise, a more enduring coronet of glory to his many virtues, than is often vouchsafed for those of more kingly lineage or more exalted station. Opholt's business, however, did not prove very successful, and Lincoln's clerkship in a little less than a year was abruptly terminated in 1832 by the outbreak of the Black Hawk War. During the previous spring, 1831, the noted Black Hawk of the Sac tribe of Indians, repudiating the treaty of 1804 by which they had been removed beyond the Mississippi, made an attempt to repossess his old hunting grounds and to establish himself where the principal village of his nation before had been in the Rock River country. The Indians began to commit depredations upon the property of the white settlers, destroying their crops, pulling down their fences, driving off and slaughtering their cattle, and ordering the settlers themselves to leave, on penalty of massacre if they remained. In response to the representations of Governor Reynolds, to whom the settlers applied for protection, General Gaines, commanding the United States forces in that quarter, took prompt and decisive measures to expel the invaders from the state. With a few companies of regular soldiers, he at once took up his position at Rock Island, and at his call several hundred volunteers assembled from the northern and central parts of the state, upon the proclamation of Governor Reynolds, joined him a month later. This little army, distributed into 2 regiments, an additional battalion, and a spy battalion, was the most formidable military force yet seen in the new state. The expected battle did not take place, the Indians having suddenly and stealthily retired again across the river. And shortly after, apparently intimidated by the threats and firm attitude of General Gaines, the wily Black Hawk sued for peace, and a treaty was entered into by which he agreed that he and his tribe should ever after remain on the west side of the river, unless by permission of the general government or of the governor of the state of Illinois. In express violation, however, of this second deliberate engagement, Black Hawk and his followers began, early in the spring of 1832, as we have seen, to make preparations for another invasion. Whatever may be said of the wrongs inflicted on the savage tribes by the white race, it is certain that the bad faith shown in this case and the repeated violation of deliberate and voluntary agreements was wholly without justification or excuse. No provocation or plausible pretext had arisen after the treaty of the previous June. Yet Black Hawk was under the misguided influence and false representations of the prophet, who persuaded him to believe that even the British, to whom Black Hawk had always been a fast friend, as well as the Ottawas, Chippewas, Winnebagos, and Potawatomis, would aid them in regaining their village and the adjoining lands. Under this delusion, to which the wiser Keokuk refused to become a dupe, though earnestly invited to join them, Black Hawk proceeded to gather as strong a force as possible. First establishing his headquarters at the old site of Fort Madison, west of the Mississippi, he proceeded with his women and children, property and camp equipage, and a strong force of armed warriors to the mouth of Rock River, where, in the early part of April 1832, the whole party crossed to the east side of the Mississippi with the avowed purpose of ascending the Rock River to the Winnebago territory. An order from General Atkinson of Rock Island, which overtook him on his route, ordering him to return beyond the Mississippi, was defiantly disregarded. The danger now seemed imminent. Volunteer companies were immediately formed in those states most exposed to the foe, and among others, a company was raised in Menard County, in the formation of which Abraham Lincoln was conspicuously active. From New Salem, Clary's Grove, and the vicinity, an efficient force was gathered, and when organized, their choice fell on Lincoln for captain. This, the first promotion which he had ever received by the suffrages of his fellows, could not have been otherwise than flattering to his unaspiring and modest nature, and may be regarded as a pleasing evidence of the estimation in which he was held by his friends and neighbors. He was wont to say that no success in life ever gave him such unalloyed satisfaction as this. An anecdote is current of our subject, pertaining to this era of his life, which is not unworthy of repetition. Soon after the election of the company officers, a friend of Captain Lincoln's had vaunted the newly elected commander as the strongest man in Illinois, when a stranger, who was listening, expressed a doubt as to the truth of the assertion, at the same time mentioning another individual whom he considered as the stouter man. The friend of the newly elected captain at length proposed a small wager, which was accepted, that his champion could lift a barrel of whiskey holding 40 gallons and drink out of the bunghole. The interested parties proceeded to Captain Abe, who was nothing averse to making the experiment for the gratification of his friend. A barrel of whiskey containing the necessary amount of gallons was accordingly procured, when the test was performed with readiness and apparent ease. As another man might have raised a 6-gallon demijohn, the barrel was lifted and the requisite mouthful extracted from the bunghole, to the astonishment of the incredulous stranger. "The bet is mine," cried the athlete's admirer, as the former replaced the barrel on the floor. "But that is the first dram of whiskey I ever saw you swallow, Abe." The captain immediately spurted the cheekful of whiskey upon the floor with the exclamation, "And I haven't swallowed that, you see." His friend burst out laughing at this demonstration of the incorrigible teetotaler. And this same friend long afterward writes, "That was the only drink of intoxicating liquor I ever knew him to take, and that he spurted out on the floor." Whether true or not, this little anecdote, so far as it concerns the whiskey, is in keeping with the temperate habits which have since distinguished him. His company rendezvoused at Beardstown. Here, 1,800 men were speedily assembled and organized into 4 regiments, with an additional spy battalion. General Samuel Whiteside was in command. General James D. Henry was placed at the head of the spy battalion. Leaving Beardstown on the 27th of April, they marched to the mouth of Rock River, and after marching 50 miles along its course, reached the Prophet's village, which they left in flames, and then pushed rapidly forward to Dixon's Ferry, 40 miles beyond where the enemy was supposed to be. On the way, they received additional reinforcements, and on the 12th of May their advance met the foe. The skirmish which ensued rapidly developed into an engagement which occupied some 500 men on each side, and which resulted in the complete rout of the whites, known to this day as Stillman's defeat. A projected renewal of the conflict on the following morning was frustrated by the sudden disappearance of the wily savages. A council of war resulted in a decision to renew the conflict early next morning. The great battle which Captain Lincoln and his fellow volunteers had come so far to participate in seemed now on the point of becoming a reality. And notwithstanding their premature advance from Prophetstown had left them without the necessary supplies and subjected them to many privations, they made up for the absence of their regular provisions as best they might, and were ready, with the dawn, for the day's undertaking. But their enemy did not await their coming. Arrived at the scene of yesterday's skirmish and flight, they found not a straggler of all the savage forces. They had gone further up the river and partly dispersed to commit depredations in the surrounding country. General Whiteside, having made this energetic attempt to fall in with the enemy and give him battle, and having buried his dead, returned to camp, where he was shortly joined by General Atkinson, with troops and supplies, increasing the number of the army to 2,500, and a few weeks more would have enabled this force to bring the war to a successful termination. This desirable consummation of their labors, however, was frustrated by the impatience of the volunteer force, whose term of service had expired, to return to their homes. The hardships of the campaign, in their opinion, far exceeded the glory which they had hoped to win, and their disappointment made them clamorous for their discharge. They were therefore marched to Ottawa and mustered out of the service on the 27th and 28th of May. This sudden disbanding without a battle and with no results accomplished was somewhat chafing to the young captain from Menard County. While others murmured and dropped out of what seemed to be an unprofitable warfare, he remained true and persistent to his convictions of duty, as eager for the fray and as ambitious to perform every item of a soldier's labor as he was at the outset. His imagination had not, as in the case of others, drawn too bright a picture of camp life, and he was consequently not as much disappointed as they, while his characteristic hearty earnestness in his work imparted cheerfulness to others and challenged their respect. We are not surprised to learn, therefore, that when Governor Reynolds, who had already issued a call for 2,000 new volunteers, asked for the formation of a volunteer regiment from those just discharged, Captain Abraham Lincoln was among the first to enroll himself as a private, as did also General Whiteside. Indeed, in calling for this regiment, Governor Reynolds is understood to have acted upon the expressed suggestions of Lincoln and others who were still ready to bear their part of the campaign to its close. So nobly true was Lincoln, even in his youth, to a stern sense of duty, and so earnest in his wish to accomplish whatever he undertook. Before the arrival of the new levies, a skirmishing fight with the Indians was had at Burr Oak Grove on the 18th of June, in which the enemy was defeated with considerable loss. Meanwhile, the Indian atrocities continued, rendering an efficient prosecution of the war to its termination indispensable. The Winnebagoes and Potawatomis also evinced a hostile disposition toward the whites and an inclination to join the movement of Black Hawk. Accordingly, with the appearance of the new levies, which had been divided into 3 regiments, and their junction with the regular and volunteer forces already in the field, the whole number of volunteers alone being 3,200, the army was placed in a formidable and effective attitude for offensive warfare, and finally made a forward movement. A severe action at Kellogg's Grove in the Indian Country on the 25th of June resulted in the retreat of the enemy with much loss. Black Hawk then withdrew his forces to a fortified position at the Four Lakes, the present site of Madison, Wisconsin, where he awaited the issue of a general engagement. On the part of the American commanders, the campaign was carried forward with all the celebrity possible. But they were in a strange country in which, for lack of correct information, they were obliged to advance slowly and cautiously. Meanwhile, the new volunteers had many of them become discontented. Nearly 2 months had now elapsed since the opening of the campaign, and its purpose seemed as remote from accomplishment as ever. Their numbers had become reduced, in fact, one half. Wearisome marches and still more wearisome delays, privations and exposure had deprived the service of whatever romance it may have originally possessed. They were fretfully sickened of duty, homesick, and eager to escape from the restraints of military life. This state of feeling, of course, hampered the action of those in command and had its effect in determining the result of the campaign. Lincoln was not of this class. As on his previous campaign, he accepted whatever befell him in the line of his duty without complaint or murmuring. It was not destined, however, that he should be actively engaged in any encounter more serious than those already mentioned. The forces were divided and dispersed in different directions for the purpose of obtaining supplies. And while thus divided, that portion of the army with which Lincoln was not connected, coming upon Black Hawk and his warriors near the present city of Madison, signally defeated and routed him, driving him down the Wisconsin to the Mississippi, where, 4 days later, the Battle of Bad Axe closed the war with the capture of the chief and his warriors. The fates were against our hero, for his division took no part in either of these battles, and before the last term of enlistment had expired, the contest was at an end. We cannot better close our brief sketch of Mr. Lincoln's military career than by presenting his own humorous and characteristic reference to it in a congressional speech delivered during the canvass of 1848. Sarcastically commenting on the efforts of General Cass's biographers to render him conspicuous as a military hero, he said, "By the way, Mr. Speaker, did you know I am a military hero? Yes, sir. In the days of the Black Hawk War, I fought, bled, and came away. Speaking of General Cass's career reminds me of my own. I was not at Stillman's defeat, but I was about as near it as Cass to Hull's surrender, and like him, I saw the place very soon afterward. It is quite certain I did not break my sword, for I had none to break, but I bent a musket pretty badly on one occasion. If Cass broke his sword, the idea is he broke it in desperation. I bent the musket by accident. If General Cass went in advance of me in picking whortleberries, I guess I surpassed him in charges upon the wild onions. If he saw any live fighting Indians, it was more than I did, but I had a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes, and although I never fainted from loss of blood, I can truly say I was often very hungry. Mr. Speaker, if I should ever conclude to doff whatever our Democratic friends may suppose there is of black cockade federalism about me, and thereupon they should take me up as their candidate for the presidency, I protest they shall not make fun of me as they have of General Cass by attempting to write me into a military hero." But, although thus humorously deprecating his own services, it will not be disputed that Mr. Lincoln, at the age of 23, faithfully acted his part as a soldier with an energy and perseverance in the face of peculiar hardship, which rebuked the lukewarmness and discontent of many older men with whom he was associated. Though he never set up any claim for a heroism which opportunity was never afforded him to exhibit, he believed that he did his duty, and such also was the opinion of others. In his brief career of 3 months' service, he acquired the reputation of a favorite in the army, an efficient officer, and a brave, patient, and reliable soldier. These early military experiences undoubtedly had no small influence in developing that paternal interest in the personal welfare of the private soldier and sailor, and that intense care for their comfort and individual rights which so eminently characterized him in later years, when as president of a great republic, he was commander-in-chief of its army and navy. The feeling which enabled him to sympathize so freely and kindly with the little trials of these humble servants of the country, which made him always as easy of access to the simple private as to the major general, which led him so frequently amid his all-engrossing cares to visit the hospitals where these brave fellows lay wounded and weary with patient waiting, which in short seemed to make his brave boys in blue as near and dear to his great heart as if almost they were his own sons. This feeling, the outgushing of his exceeding kindness of disposition, was no doubt intensified by the remembrance of what he himself had experienced while a frontier volunteer in the old Black Hawk War.